guys, Clayton here. Now that you just saw my worst movies of the decade, it's now time to talk about the best movies of the decade. Much like the last video, this is not going to be in any particular order, more or less going by the year they came out. And also like last time, if you disagree with why I put on my best of the decade, that is totally fine. You're not an idiot, you're not below me, you're not stupid, whatever have you. We're all different in our opinions of movies, and that's a good thing. But unlike the worst movies of the decade, I have a list of honorable mentions. Just movies that I think are really, really good. You should totally see them. But I just thought they weren't like top. I mean, well, they're still good. I still recommend them, you know. Anyway, here we go. Kick-Ass 1 and 2, Despicable Me, Megamind, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, Tangled, Paul, Attack the Block, Thor, Captain America the First Avenger, X-Men First Class, Insidious Chapters 1, 2, and 3, Kung Fu Panda 2 and 3, Rango, Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, Rogue Nation, and Fallout, Arthur Christmas, 21 and 22 Jump Street, Ted, The Dark Knight Rises, Dread, Frankenweenie, Sinister, Wreck-It Ralph, Rise of the Guardians, The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, The Desolation of Smaug and the Battle of the Five Armies, Evil Dead, Iron Man 3, This Is the End, The Conjuring 1 and 2, Pacific Rim, Frozen, The Lego Movie, Neighbors 1 and 2, Godzilla, X-Men Days of Future Past, John Wick, Chapters 1, 2, and 3, Tomorrowland, The Visit, Kingsman The Secret Service, Avengers Age of Ultron, Creed and Creed 2, The Hateful Eight, The Jungle Book, Don't Breathe, 10 Cloverfield Lane, Deadpool, It, Wonder Woman, Split, Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home, Kong Skull Island, Upgrade, Deadpool 2, Black Panther, Bumblebee, Incredibles 2, Rocket Man, Us, Knives Out, Klaus, and this one I'm going to talk about a bit because I just recently saw it. I'm talking about Joker. Now, Joker I thought was good. That's kind of how I feel about Black Panther. It's good, but I wouldn't call it exactly a masterpiece. The thing is, there are some stuff to really like about it. The best one being Joaquin Phoenix's performance. This is actually one of his best performances of any movie he's been in. And also the cinematography is great, the score, a lot of stuff is really good, and even like the stuff that kind of messes with your head, like is it all real or is it part of his like illusion or maybe it's something he's making up. But I think the one thing that kind of drags it down a bit is the whole thing about society, insert we live in a society joke here. That really is not saying anything new. And I hate using this word, but it comes off kind of pretentious the way it goes about it. Because it's trying to say something new, something about society, which can be a good thing, but it kind of comes off full of itself when it talks about it, or even the not so subtle way about making inappropriate jokes. That being said, Joker is a good movie, and I do have another R-rated comic book movie in my best of the decade, but I wouldn't necessarily call it it's like, again, when I think about Black Panther, it's really, really good, but a little overhyped. That's just me, though. If you really love it, that is totally fine. Alright, let's get on with it. This is my best movies of the 2010 decade. Alright, starting off with 2010. Well, actually, it's going to be 2010 and 2019 for these two movies because one started the decade and the other one ended the decade. I'm, of course, talking about two of Pixar's biggest risks, Toy Story 3 and Toy Story 4. Toy Story 3 came out when I was 15 years old when Toy Story 3 came out. And like Nordy, when he talks about Toy Story 3, I was one of those kids who thought I was too old for animation. But, much like him, Toy Story 3 did actually inspire me a little more. I originally wanted a career in animation, though right now I'm focusing on writing a graphic novel, but Toy Story 3 made me discover more possibilities of animation. Like, I look back at some of the old movies I loved as a kid, and some still hold up, and some don't. But Toy Story 3 was... The thing about Toy Story 3, other than discovering my passion for animation, it was also the movie that came out at the right time. I was in high school when this movie came out, or like midway through high school. And I was a kid who loved Toy Story. So, watched the first movie on VHS, I remember seeing the second movie in theaters, and this was a movie that kind of talked to the adult in me, like the growing adult in me. The movie's themes of growing up and moving on is really, like, it's deep for a movie that's basically about toys. and also for the third one, it's surprisingly dark. But I guess it kind of has to be because the movie is pretty much the finale. Like, this is more the finale of the toys and Andy. And it's delivered in probably one of the most emotional endings you'll ever see in any animated movie. And with Toy Story 4, again, we can argue whether or not the movie was necessary, but Toy Story 4 serves as the perfect epilogue for the series. It shows more like the growing development of Woody, basically showing him still holding on to Andy, and and while the third one was more about growing up and moving on, the fourth one is more so on moving on. That things change, and that's okay. We all have to move on when we've already fulfilled our purpose. And both movies still contain the charm, the humor, and the heart of the previous two movies. And that's always what I've loved about Toy Story and Pixar. They have a lot of heart and charm to them. And with the complaints about Toy Story 4, I've heard a lot. If anything, my only complaint is just that the side characters like Jessie, Bullseye, Rex don't really do much except for the ending. And while they don't get enough screen time, but it's made up for it with the newer characters, which I love. One complaint I don't get is the whole, like, Bonnie's the real villain. Like, for starters, she's a kid. What toys have we played when we were kids and we've eventually moved on to another toy? And plus, I mean, and really, if you're complaining about her, like, because of what Andy said, I mean, unless she's Bonnie from Kim Possible, then I would get your point. But again, this Bonnie is a kid. And also the whole Woody being selfish, which he really isn't. If he was stuck in Bonnie's room, he would just be depressed the whole time. I mean, really, let the man be happy. Or the toy, at least. Toy Story 3 and 4 are two of Pixar's biggest risks. With Toy Story 3, it was nearly 10 years after Toy Story 2. And usually third movies in a franchise don't turn out so good. But this one managed to be one of the rare cases that actually did turn out to be just as good, if not more so. And with Toy Story 4 was another big risk because it served as the epilogue to something that is almost reaching 10 years, like almost 9 years after Toy Story 3. And they managed to pull it off successfully. I doubt they should do a Toy Story 5, but hey, we've all been proven wrong with 3 and 4. So if there is more to tell with a Toy Story 5, maybe we can see what happens. These movies all four of them are in my top 5 favorite movies of all time because I love them that much. I put all 4 of them because they just tell one big story focusing on all these things that we hold dear. Next up in 2010, we have another one of my favorite movies, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. This is the movie that I discovered the genius of Edgar Wright, of how great of a director he is, and he's become one of my favorites. He managed to translate, and now I saw the movie before I read the comics, and having just read the comics, the movie is extremely faithful to the comics. Like, it is gleefully, full of effort, recreating panel for panel the original 6 volumes that were made. They recreated a lot of things from it. And while they don't adapt everything, it still remains a very faithful adaptation. The one thing I will say the comics did slightly better than the movie would have to be Scott and Ramona's relationship, as that is more developed in the comics. But I still like their relationship well enough in this movie. Michael Cera, I know he's usually one note a lot of movies, I mean, with the exception of something like This Is the End. But this movie actually showed that he can actually be a capable action star. And while Scott is a jerk, he grows throughout the whole movie. And another great thing, other than how great it's directed, because this, whenever you ask someone, is there a world, a movie world you'd love to live in? This is one I would love to live in, because it's a great mix of, a comic book, an anime, and a video game in this one world. You see a lot of the text that appears in comics, when you punch someone, it says POW on it, or you get, these little video game stats when you do something, and stuff like that, which is really, it hits the inner geek in me. It's just, I would love to live in this kind of world. And the fight sequences are all well choreographed. While there is stunt doubles, Michael Cera actually does a really good job with the action part of it. And speaking of something with the action, because you can't have your hero without the villains, and while movies there's some movies that get a lot of crap for having too many villains. Like, I think the biggest examples are something like Spider-Man 3 and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And while I may be one of the few people who defend Spider-Man 3, the three villain problem was prevalent as well. But this movie, like the villains, the X's, while they get enough development of the fact that they have been in past relationships with Ramona and they want to kill Scott, it's pretty much like bosses in a video game. But the thing is, they're all memorable. From Matthew Patel, Lucas Lee, Brandon Ruth as not Lucas Lee. That's Chris Evans. He was the second X. But I'm blanking on his name, but he's the third X, the vegan, and he was so good in that. And it's also kind of the ironic thing that Scott dated Brie Larson's in the movie. He dated Captain Marvel, and yet defeated Captain America and Superman. I know everyone's made that joke, but it's always funny to know that. But Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, it's pretty much the inner geek in me. But while I love movies that are while movies can be challenging, but I love movies that are really like more for the escapism. And Scott Pilgrim is one that I would just love to escape to this world that they've made. Next up is another sort of movie that can qualify as an escapee movie, but also really makes you think, Inception. Christopher Nolan, while I really like his work, there is more I need to see, like Memento. I've never seen Memento. But I love the Dark Knight trilogy, and while I don't think this is as good as Dark Knight, Inception is a movie that really, like, that's what I love about it. It really plays with your mind. It's one of those that's like, is it a dream or is it not? And it's always that kind of thing that's interesting to me. I really love the action in this one, like the whole zero gravity feel with Joseph Gordon-Levitt. That scene was excellent. Speaking of that, the acting is really good from Leo DiCaprio, Ellen Page, Michael Caine, of course, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. But I think one of the best things about Inception is the way that it alters your reality after the first viewing. The movie makes you question everything right after you finish watching it for the first time. And it took me like maybe 2 or 3 viewings to watch to fully get the whole movie. I love it, but it took me a while to actually kind of get it, but I guess that sounds stupid, but it's one of the things that makes the movie work. It makes you question things. And that's always a good sign of a great movie. And that's why Inception is one of the best movies of the 2010s. Though up there with the Inception is The Social Network. While Mark Zuckerberg has said that parts of this movie are not entirely true, the movie still holds like sort of a really great realistic portrayal of what happens when you try starting something with your friends and what could lead to it. From corruption, lawsuits, all that stuff. It's like a courtroom drama outside of the courtroom, and it's really well done. Jesse Eisenberg, as Mark Zuckerberg, is one of those characters you love to hate. Like, you absolutely you hate this guy because he's such a jerk. But some of the stuff he says makes sense, and you kind of root for him at some points. But other than that, like, the other actors, Andrew Garfield, Justin Timberlake, Armie Hammer, and I forgot who the other guy who played those as the twins, all of them were really good. And while I haven't watched much of David Fincher's movies, I probably should. But this is the first one I've seen from him, and honestly, this was a really well-written movie as well. Him and Aaron Sorkin wrote the film, and it's one of the few movies where it's mostly talking, but it's really it's like a Quentin Tarantino movie, where it's mostly dialogue, but it's very entertaining to listen to and watch. But what really gets it right is it's pretty much the movie of our generation, like the drama of our generation, because all of us use Facebook pretty much, and the movie shows, while not entirely true, it can still work. And lastly, in the 2010s, we have another animated movie that started the decade, but also continued through and ended off the decade. I'm of course talking about the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy. While I love the Kung Fu Panda movies and the first 2 Shreks, How to Train Your Dragon, the whole entire trilogy to me, is probably my favorite of the DreamWorks franchises. What it is that, while the first movie has some cliches that could be tiring, but it's told in a very fresh way, with really likable characters, it's funny, but it's also really emotionally impactful. The sequels are a lot more fresh in that regard, in which I'll admit that's kind of why I prefer the sequels, because they did seem a little more fresh. But the main heart of the movie is without a doubt Hiccup's relationship with Toothless. I described it as pretty much a Viking version of A Boy and His Pet. And it shows from them not liking each other, like sort of a whole King Kong thing about, I don't know if I really describe it as King Kong, but more or less showing that maybe these animals aren't as dangerous as we thought, and growing as they grow more as friends, but eventually have to part ways towards the end of their journey. Also, it kind of serves as sort of a coming of age story for Hiccup, where he starts off as a very wimpy Viking teenager and grows up to pretty much be a man. Speaking of Hiccup, though, like I mentioned this before in my best of 2019, but his relationship with Astrid, especially in the sequels, those two are relationship goals. Like whenever I get a girlfriend, I want a relationship like that because their banter together and all that is just so adorable. It is so cute. Not only that, the animation is fantastic. Like especially when the sequels got better with animation, the flying, especially with the flying sequences. I didn't see these movies in 3D, but it made you feel like you were flying along with Hiccup. If I had to choose between all three of them, I would. It's kind of hard because I love the first one as well, and I love the sequels. And I'm debating between 2 and 3 because 2 had the grander scale. It had a really intimidating villain. It had a much darker storyline. And the third one had a much more emotional feel to it. Like this one felt a lot more like a grand finale. I don't know, but regardless, I still consider all three How to Train Your Dragons as my favorite of DreamWorks' oeuvre of films. Alright, moving on to 2011, we have another movie that kind of gets overlooked lately, Hugo. Hugo, now I will say this, I have not read the book it's based on, and I kind of want to. But the thing with Hugo is directed by Martin Scorsese, and I haven't watched much of his movies to be honest, but and it's probably the first one I ever watched, and this is a really good one. With Hugo, it tells the story of an orphan boy who lives in the train station but discovers like this big secret. And what leads to this secret actually kind of grows into more an appreciation for the art of filmmaking. I won't spoil much of it, but it shows how much like the movies can mean to a lot of people. More or less, it's the power of imagination. And that's what the things I love about movies. It's pretty much projecting your imagination onto the big screen. The acting all around is really good, especially the chemistry between Asa Butterfield as Hugo and Chloe Grace Moretz. Both of them have really good chemistry, and as well as the other actors do a really good job, from Ben Kingsley, Sacha Baron Cohen, and many others. All of them do a really fantastic job in this. Not only that, the movie is beautiful to look at, and you really get the feel of where it's set, like in this train station, and how it feels like a movie from the past. Like I said, it's kind of getting overlooked nowadays. Like, a lot of people are seeming to forget about it. Maybe this should be the time we should probably remind people how great of a movie Hugo is. Speaking of overlooked, though, another one, Super 8. I know a lot of people love to rag about J.J. Abrams, and I think he's a very talented filmmaker. I love J.J. Abrams. And with Super 8, a lot of people when it came out, while it was praised, a lot of people complained that it was pretty much too much of him. Well, I'm not going to say it, but pretty much of him stroking Spielberg's ego. But more or less, I don't really see it as that. I more saw it as a tribute to the early golden years of Spielberg, from his movies like Close Encounters, E.T., or even stuff that he produced like The Goonies. And considering that we're at a time now where Stranger Things has become like this big like hit for Netflix, maybe Super 8 should probably get another look at, because there's a lot of things that really work. I love the chemistry between the kids in the movie. I love the budding relationship between Joel Courtney and Elle Fanning's characters, and also the relationship between him and his father, played by Kyle Chandler. The mystery behind the monster was really great. I love that it's kept in like we are not seeing the monster until close to near the end. And while some people did complain that the ending's a little cheesy, I don't know, I really loved it. Speaking of because one of the things that hindered it is Michael Giacchino's excellent score, particularly to the ending, because it reminded me a lot of memories of watching E.T. as a kid. And also, I really love because the whole movie is about these kids making a Super 8 film for a film festival, and I love that during the credits, you see the movie they made, and it's just great. It's a movie that brought me back to, like I said, when I was a kid and I watched E.T. for the first time. And it's a very special movie because of it. Again, Super 8 really deserves more attention than it needs. However, next up is the start of a trilogy. Again, starting up a new trilogy that not a lot of people probably thought they didn't want, but we got anyway. And those being Rise, Dawn, and War for the Planet of the Apes. Now, truth be told, around this time I'd never seen any of the Planet of the Apes movies. I did go around to watch the original because my cousin has told me that's his absolute favorite movie. And it is. It's a really good science fiction movie. with Rise, it manages to take like the idea of how the whole ape uprising started and sort of like building up to how we would see it today as the Planet of the Apes. Um, the best thing about all three of these movies is without doubt Andy Serkis' performance as Caesar. Not just with just his motion capture performances, he's able to give out a really great dramatic performance, especially without dialogue, no less. And it really shows even how technology has gone that we are believing that these apes, even though they're made from a computer, are real. The thing I love also about these movies is that even with the previous sequels, how dark and even how serious they do take themselves with something ridiculous as Planet of the Apes. But it shows like how these apes rose to power, and it's really great seeing how the tension between the humans and the apes could lead to this big, like, altering universe in a way. And that's what I love. With the human characters, a lot of them are really good. I love James Franco in Rise. I loved the humans in Dawn. And I especially love Woody Harrelson in War. As all of them did a really good job. Even some of the... I especially love Kovu in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. Because he was one of the most intense and even scariest villains of any movie this decade. Like, he was one bad monkey, if you get what I mean. But other than that, for me, it's hard for me to choose because much like How to Train Your Dragon, I love all three of these movies, but if I had to choose, I'd probably say War is definitely the best out of the three because, much like with How to Train Your Dragon, this one builds to a really big, climactic, emotional ending. And even for a movie series that not a lot of people were wanting to happen, I'm kind of glad we did get it. Speaking of emotional endings, next up for 2011, we have the ending of one of the biggest book series of all time, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. As a kid, I love Harry Potter. I've honestly have not read the books, but I did remember seeing the movie, The Sorcerer's Stone, in theaters when I was a kid. And from then, seeing the rest of the series go on as they continued. And one of the things about Harry Potter, especially with this one, and while I love Deathly Hallows Part 1, I did kind of prefer this one because it does, again, brings everything to an emotional end. And it's really sad to see our favorite Hogwarts students go. But it's also really great seeing Daniel Radcliffe, Rupert Grint, Emma Watson, Tom Felton, all these young actors, as you grow with them, especially with kids like me who are late 90s, early 2000s kids, who grew up with these characters and seeing them grow with you. I was 16 when this movie hit, and right around the time it was close to middle of high school, and it really brings the emotional tears to see all these characters you grow and have all their stories come to an end, and showing that this whole franchise really is something. And while this did also start a trend of, Deathly Hallows did kind of start a trend with having a lot of book to movies be split into two parts, or at least movies in general. There's some that work. I'm actually one of the few people who like the Hobbit movies, and it was understandable as well. That one worked as well, even if Chapter 2 wasn't that great. But I think Harry Potter was the best out of all of these, because they managed to compact the entire final book but tell a faithful adaptation of it through two movies. And there's nothing more I can say but thank you, J.K. Rowling. I know we're a lot mixed on you, but thank you for bringing us this great series, and thanks to all the great filmmakers who have brought this series to life. And without Harry Potter, we would not discover a great world of magic. And rounding off 2011, we have an animated movie here from one of the best directors of all time, The Adventures of Tintin. Motion capture has always been kind of hard to do when it comes to animated movies without reaching an uncanny valley, kind of like what Robert Zemeckis does. While I love The Polar Express, and I really liked the adaptation of A Christmas Carol, there's even times where it does kind of lead into uncanny valley. With Tintin, you don't really get that uncanny feeling with them and while they are overly exaggerated to look like their comic book counterparts, they look real, and it feels real as well. Tintin is pretty much Spielberg's kind of return after a lot of the backlash he got. And while I'm one of the few people who will kind of defend Crystal Skull, this is sort of a return to form with the whole classic matinee adventure. And it really is a fun adventure. I love the chemistry between Tintin and Haddock. Snowy he's just an adorable little dog. I really love the comedy duo of Thompson Thompson, played by one of our greatest comedy duos, Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. It's just a really well-made, fun movie, and it's great to see sort of a fun Saturday matinee adventure movies. And while we've been getting some with stuff like the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, this is one where it's kind of like a return to something like what made Indiana Jones so great. And it's definitely one of the best animated movies to come out this decade. Alright, moving on to 2012. Now this one was like one of the biggest build-ups of any comic book movie, and I'm going to talk about the other ones as well. But of course, I'm talking about The Avengers. And right along with it, I'll also talk about Infinity War and Endgame. With The Avengers, Avengers was probably one of the, along with Endgame, was one of the biggest like build-up events. Like all three of them are the biggest build-up of any sort of comic book movie, and they all pay off excellently. With The Avengers, it was a build-up to seeing like all these characters throughout the movies. Like they had their own separate adventures, but building up to this one big event and seeing them all together for the first time. And that's what made the movie so special, was because of the camaraderie at first. Like, they don't get along at first, but eventually they have to work together to stop a common threat. And also with the Avengers is that it was one of the best, all three of these were like some of the best experiences I'll talk about later, but the Avengers is a little more simple, I'll give it that. And that's what I love about it, because it is just a straight up fun movie, but still having these really likable characters that you grow to love. And even showing, like, through their camaraderie, they can still work together as a team. Loki is one of the best of the MCU villains, and while I will say this, Phase 3, and even bits of Phase 2 has some really good villains, Loki stands out because while he's intimidating, he can be he's a very tragic character. That's what made him so great in Thor. Also, speaking as a fan of this character, Mark Ruffalo killed it as the Hulk and Bruce Banner. I absolutely loved him in this. It made me feel like a kid again, reading the comics, watching a bit of the old TV show, just like showing how perfectly they adapted the Hulk onto the big screen in this movie. And with Infinity War and Endgame, this was a build-up for almost 10 years, because at the very end of the first Avengers, you see Thanos. And it's been building up throughout the course of 2 phases to finally get him, and it is glorious. While Infinity War starts off like, you get the standard stuff that what made the first Avengers so great, it hits you real hard with Thanos snapping half the universe away. I almost was in tears when Spider-Man when he said he wasn't feeling so good, and when he was holding on to Tony and he was crying. Like, I almost wanted to cry as well. But also, given with and while Endgame, I described Endgame as pretty much the most grounded out of all the Avengers movies, because it starts off in a very dark place where they didn't win. Like, they failed pretty much, but they had to learn to, they eventually had to grow and fix things. And even showing, how deep some of the characters are, from Tony, starting a family, but losing someone he was holding dear to, or even someone like Thor, who has failed twice. I know a lot of people complain about the fat jokes made of him, but it's a really realistic portrayal of his depression, of how he lost and he fell into a state of depression and he has no path, but he eventually makes up for it to show how worthy he still is. And like I said, I just love these characters, and it was really great to see from 10 years with Infinity War and Endgame, to see all these characters I've loved, grown and loved the past 10 to 11 years, and to finally see some of their stories, especially with Iron Man and Captain America, come to a pretty satisfying ending. And also what hinders both Infinity War and Endgame is Thanos. Thanos is one of the best of the Marvel villains. He is intimidating right when he walks on the screen. He is someone you do not want to mess with, because he'll wreck your crap up. But with all that, if the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole is this generation's, big movie events. I know a lot of people compare it to Star Wars, because it pretty much is our generation's Star Wars. And I look forward to more of what they're coming out with, and even exploring new characters like Shang-Chi and the Eternals. But I don't know how they're going to top how epic the finale, how great it was to see the Avengers come together for the first time, and then bring on the epic conclusions with Infinity War and Endgame. Alright, next up in 2012, we're going to take a little trip into horror a little bit with The Cabin in the Woods. Cabin in the Woods kind of is it's a very clever movie is the best way to describe it. Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard came up with this idea to not only make a horror story, but to also satirize it in a way that's actually like really says something about the state of horror. Playing with horror tropes, playing with all that stuff, but also kind of showing how audiences, like especially with the idea of the ancient ones, showing how the audience will react to a horror movie. Whether something changes and they will, in order to satisfy them. And it's a really clever and deep movie if you really think about it. I know a lot of people are kind of also mixed about the ending, but again, it's also to serve how the metaphor for the ancient ones on how they work. Not only that, not only is the movie can be scary at times, but it's also really funny. There is a lot of... It's also like thanks to Joss Whedon's like very comedically driven, snappy dialogue, and it's really, really well done. The Cabin in the Woods is one of... I don't know if I'll really call it... It's one of the best horror satires I've ever seen. It shows that horror can take itself, like, show just how repetitive sometimes horror can get, but sometimes try something new. And it's actually one of the best. Alright, next up is actually the one that actually won Best Picture, Argo. Now, Ben Affleck is actually a really good director. Now, granted, I've only seen two of those movies, this and Gone Baby Gone, which is great. I will see The Town at some point, as well as, what was the last one? He did Gone Girl. But Argo, I think, is honestly his best movie. It's based on a declassified true story of 6 American hostages in Iran. And this guy, in order to get them out of there, like, they're out to pretend like, hey, we're making a fake sci-fi fantasy movie called Argo. And they're going to pretend like the 6 hostages are the crew so they can get them out of there. And it's one of those where it's like, you know, I'm surprised it actually worked, and the movie, I'm surprised actually that this did turn out to be real, because it's very, very realistic in the way it's done. Like, it's filmed excellent, the actors are all great, Ben Affleck, John Goodman, Alan Arkin, Bryan Cranston, all the actors are so good in this movie. And the last half of the movie, like the last 30 or so minutes are like edge of your seat intense, like you are wondering if they are going to make it out. Like, even though you kind of know how it ends because it is based on a true story, it still gets you on the edge thinking, like, are they going to make it or are they not? Argo is, without a doubt, one of Ben Affleck's best movies, and honestly, I do want to see more from him. I know he gets a lot of crap for stuff like, you know, Geely or even Batman, which I didn't mind him as Batman, honestly, but shows how great of a director he truly is. Speaking of great directors, next up on my list, Django Unchained. Quentin Tarantino's take on a spaghetti western, but mixing it with more of a revenge movie. I know a lot of people kind of nitpick the whole thing, like, you know, they constantly say, I'm not going to say it, but they constantly say the N-word a lot. But it's set during, like, that period, like, sort of around the Civil War era where we still had slavery. And the idea is actually kind of a really good sort of fantasy idea of what if someone bought a slave and used him like to get revenge on these slave owners just to and also to rescue his girlfriend. That alone is actually a really good one, and much like other Tarantino movies, it's written well, it's acted well, like all the actors are great, especially Leonardo DiCaprio, because there's that one scene where he has his dialogue and he smashes his hand on a skull, and while he's bleeding, he still goes with it. Like, that's talent right there. That is greatness. And even for a Tarantino movie that's meant to be a Western, the production design and the way it's filmed is fantastic. Like, it actually feels like one of those old Western movies. And I mentioned this before in my DVD and Blu-ray collection that I actually showed my grandpa this, because my grandpa, he loves, like, old Westerns. He loves watching that kind of stuff. Like, he loves John Wayne. He loves stuff like Tales of Wells Fargo and all that. He loves watching old Westerns. And despite all the blood that is shown, like, in very Tarantino-like ways, he ended up really loving it, and he actually eventually got the movie on DVD. Goes to show that even Westerns still have a foot in, and though it's a genre that many people consider a dying one, but stuff like this and even The Hateful Eight show that Westerns can still be made great. Alright, we also got an animated movie here from a very great studio that doesn't really get much attention, but should deserve it, Paranorman. Laika is one of the few movies that studios that does stop motion, and even though some of their movies bomb, they still keep going. And while I love Coraline, and even The Box Trolls wasn't their best movie, and I liked Missing Link also, but Paranorman and another one coming up later are what I consider their best movies. With Paranorman, it takes the idea of, we see a lot of stop motion movies with sort of a Halloweenish type theme, Nightmare Before Christmas is certainly popular. But with this one, it is a very, it's a premise similar to The Sixth Sense, where a kid can talk to the dead, but he's seen as an outcast. But he eventually has to use his talents when a witch's curse affects the town he's in. But also what kind of leads to it is this whole message of basically don't judge a book by its cover. I won't get into too much of spoilers if any of y'all have not seen it, but it's a really deep emotion. It's surprisingly deep, especially with who the witch is, and when you find that out, it's really sad. And especially, even this is one of the few movies that, while many movies put zombies as these brainless, flesh-eating monsters, they kind of humanize the zombies, which is always a great thing. I watch this movie every year. The voice acting is all around great. Cody Smith-McPhee as Norman is great. Anna Kendrick as his sister. Casey Affleck as Norman's friend's brother, the older brother. He is so funny in this. Him and Christopher Mintz-Plasse as the bully. Those two are really funny in this. If you have not seen Paranorman, I highly recommend it, especially around Halloween, because I love watching this movie around the Halloween season. And it's definitely one of the best modern-day anime movies to come out the decade. And rounding up 2012, we have a found footage movie, and actually one of the best found footage movies, Chronicle. As you can tell, I don't know if y'all can tell, but I'm also a really huge comic book nerd, and I love the concept of superheroes. And the idea is basically kind of in a similar way to Unbreakable, where what if these powers are given to these kids in the real world? In this case, these 3 kids get telekinesis. At first, they start pulling pranks on people, basically what all teenagers would do. But eventually, they have to learn to control their powers, and more specifically, it's not just a superhero origin, more or less, it's more like the creation of a villain. Because the main focus of this movie, Andrew, played by Dane DeHaan, who is phenomenal in this, he is by far one of the most tragic characters of any movie. At first from the trailer, you'd think he'd just be some little punk kid. But he turned out to be way more sympathetic than I think anyone could have imagined from that trailer. And for a found footage movie, it's actually really well executed with the way they use the cameras. One of the best aspects of the movie is, even there's parts where they show multiple camera angles. You're getting this from different sources. For instance, close to the end of the movie, Andrew gets all these different cameras. You get a video camera I'm recording right now, or cell phones, an iPad at one point. Or even during the climactic battle, there's some guy recording it from his house, and his wife is like, honey, get away from the window. And he's like, baby, are you seeing this? That's one of the things I like about this, where you show this big of an event from different angles, and it's actually really well executed. It's kind of a shame, though, that Josh Trank kind of fell off a bit after the failure of Fan Four Stick, which while I hated that movie, he doesn't deserve a lot of the hate. I really wish he will, and I do hope for the best that he gets back on his feet, because Chronicle is one of the best, not just one of the best found footage movies, but one of the best superhero or even supervillain movies ever made. Alright, now moving on to 2013, we have the finale of Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy, The World's End. Not to be confused with This Is the End, but The World's End is pretty much these friends reconnecting together. One of them wants to complete a bar crawl or a pub crawl that they couldn't complete as teenagers. But then when they return to their hometown, it pretty much becomes Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This movie still retains a lot of the things that make the Cornetto trilogy so amazing, from the way it's shot, the way it's edited. It's Edgar Wright, who knows his stuff, a breakneck pace, the editing, the acting all around, especially from Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, who always had great chemistry. And I kind of like, even in this one, their roles are kind of reversed, where in the previous 2 movies, Simon Pegg was a lot more competent. He may not have been bright, but he was always competent, and Nick Frost was kind of the idiot. Pretty much he was kind of the dumb one. But in this movie, Simon Pegg is a little more incompetent, but Nick Frost he's got his stuff together, and when he gets mad, that's when he shows off how much of a badass he can be, because he's actually a really badass fighter in this, and I'm actually quite surprised. Other than that, much like with Scott Pilgrim, the action sequences are so well choreographed. It's definitely one of the most action-packed of the Cornetto trilogy. And with the way it ends, I think it is really a fitting end to this entire trilogy. Even if the movies are not connected, they're connected through little Easter eggs, little themes, and it is one of the best trilogies of all time. Next up, we have Gravity. Gravity has been considered by some to be sort of a style over substance movie. And while I kind of disagree with that whole technique, I will say this. It's not much of a movie, but more of an experience. You actually feel like you're in space with Sandra Bullock and George Clooney throughout the entire movie. Because the way it's shot, it's all done on a blue screen, but it makes you feel like you're really in space. Like, all this stuff is happening out there up in the galaxy up there above Earth. It's probably one of the most intense movies to come out in the decade, because you really are hanging on the edge of your seat as Sandra Bullock and George Clooney are just floating up in space, hitting satellites and coming across anything in order to get back to Earth. Speaking of which, Sandra Bullock is really, her character is fantastic in this. Her character's arc, and how pretty much her symbolic rebirth throughout the course of the movie is moving. And it's actually one of her, right up there with The Blind Side and even something like The Heat. This is one of her best performances of any movie. Now, with this one, Alfonso Cuarón, I have not watched some of his movies. I probably should, because the only ones I've seen were this and Prisoner of Azkaban, which I love also. But like I said, Gravity is more or less an experience, and it kind of shows how intense things could be when you're up in the space. Alright, next up is a movie that honestly kind of got snubbed for Oscars in 2013, Prisoners. This is a hard movie to get through, and I'm not saying that in a bad way, I'm actually saying that in a good way, because this movie is so dark, it's a very drab movie that it feels so real when you watch it. It's a fairly realistic premise of what happens when two families and two of their daughters get kidnapped, and the drama that escalates when the two fathers, Hugh Jackman and Terrence Howard, and the cop, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, have to go to find them, and how far they'll go. One of the best things about this movie is that it's in a very gray area. Pretty much the whole thing is that you don't know who's going to be the hero, who's going to be the villain. And that's one of the things that makes it work, because Hugh Jackman and Jake Gyllenhaal in particular have such great performances. With Hugh Jackman, you sympathize with the guy, kind of showing how far he'll go to find his daughter. And while it's 2.5 hours, but the drama, because the drama keeps escalating, it never feels boring. It actually goes at a very good pace. A lot of people are kind of split on this is a lot of people who are kind of split on endings a lot in this list, isn't it? But the ending leaves on such a kind of ambiguous note, but it's all up to your imagination whether you want to see it as a happy ending or a drab ending, going by kind of the darker tone of this movie. Like I said, Prisoners, despite the praise it's gotten, it's kind of gotten overlooked, and honestly, we should give it more attention, because it definitely deserves it. And rounding off 2013, we have one of the more underrated, even underappreciated movies to have come out, Saving Mr. Banks. While this isn't entirely accurate to the whole story of P.L. Travers and Walt Disney to get Mary Poppins made, it is a really well-told movie showing while P.L. Travers was a very sour person during the making, and kind of a nightmare to work with when making Mary Poppins, the movie shows kind of her reasons why the character of Mary Poppins, as well as Mr. Banks, was so important to her. More or less about her father. And a lot of people have complained that the whole flashback sequences of her kind of slow the movie down, but I honestly was really interested to seeing the escalation of, and also the relationship between Travers and her father. And it's also helped with Emma Thompson, who is fantastic in the movie, as well as Tom Hanks as Walt Disney. While he doesn't look like Walt Disney, you actually feel like he's the Uncle Walt that Disney portrayed himself back then. And I'm unfortunate that I still haven't seen A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood yet because I hear he's really good in that one too. But it's like Tom Hanks can honestly do no wrong with certain roles like this, playing real life good figures. The ending, like I said, the ending isn't entirely accurate to what happened, but in this kind of instance, I will kind of let it slide because it is a very sweet and happy ending. But also, one of the things I really love about this movie, it's a Disney movie that shows straight up like the making of a Disney movie and how fascinating it turned out to be. Like from the making of the songs with the Sherman Brothers, the script reading, among many others. A lot of people, even at the time, complained about how sugarcoated the movie is, and that's something I kind of disagree with because I don't really feel this one is as sugarcoated as so many people make it out to be. If it was sugarcoated, they wouldn't show, even in the movie, they show Walt Disney smoking and drinking because, like, even in real life, Walt Disney was a chain smoker and he even swears on a few occasions. With that said, Saving Mr. Banks, like Prisoners, deserves way more attention than it needs because it's such an underappreciated movie and one of the best Disney movies to come out in the decade. Alright, moving on to 2014, we got a very ambitious, super ambitious movie, by the way, Boyhood. From the director of School of Rock, this is pretty much his pet project that he wanted to make that took almost 12 years to make with the same actors from Ethan Hawke, Patricia Arquette, even the kids, like one of them is his own daughter. And it's more or less, because I know a lot of people complain about it's boring and it's nearly 3 hours long, but the movie more or less is kind of a real slice of life. It more or less is kind of reflecting on your youth. Like, more or less, because even as a kid in the 90s and even of the early 2000s, there are some parts I do connect with. Like, from, like, the mother, like, the relationship with the stepfather, or even stuff like he's watching Dragon Ball Z on TV, or even seeing his dad, because I was that kid when I was younger. Me and my sister had to see our real dad on Wednesdays and every other weekend. We were those kids. And all that, the acting is really good, like, especially the kid. He grows up, like, even as he grows, he actually is a really good actor. And I wonder if he does anything else, because I want to see him in more stuff. Patricia Arquette, Ethan Hawke are good. I'm blanking on the actor who plays the stepdad, the white-haired stepdad, because that guy, he is one of those characters you will love to hate, because he is such a jerk throughout the movie, and it's like, you're thankful that Patricia Arquette left him. If I do have any problems with the movie, I would say that yeah, as much I don't mind the 3 hour runtime. It does kind of drag in some areas, and the little sister, she was really annoying in the first few, like in sort of around the first half of the movie. She was kind of annoying, but eventually, like as she grows, like along with the other characters, as she grows, she does get better. Then that I will say. Boyhood is like I said, Boyhood is very ambitious. It may not be for everyone, but for the ambition it is, I definitely say it's worth recommending. Sorry. Next up was another movie that got snubbed for Oscars and only got one nomination, and I'm of course talking about Nightcrawler. Much like Prisoners, this is a very real kind of movie, in that it feels very realistic. With a character like who Jake Gyllenhaal plays, this is a character you'd want to hate. He's a thief, he's a jerk, he's pretty obnoxious with the camera, like getting up in everyone, like to see the crime. But yet he comes off so likable, like you almost believe in him, like you would trust him. And that's always the magic of Jake Gyllenhaal, because he is absolutely fantastic in this. As well as the other actors, Rene Russo and even the late Bill Paxton, are all really good in it. But I think one thing that really does kind of work in this movie is the whole depiction of news. No, like how the news exploits crimes and how morally right or wrong it is, because it really shows like how manipulative it could kind of be in that sort of sense. If there is something to say, like it does kind of slow in a little bit, but for what it is a really good slow burn kind of movie. In that you like following this character who may be psychotic, but you believe in him and you want to see him succeed, even if he is a terrible person. And that's the magic of, and it's really a really well shot movie too. From the lighting and everything else, it is one of the best looking movies of 2014. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Again, much like with Prisoners and Saving Mr. Banks, it gets overlooked real quick. And honestly, these are a lot of movies that do deserve a lot of attention. Next up, we're going to take a superhero who might be silly, like at least even the concept is kind of silly, but turn him into a total badass. And I'm of course talking about Captain America, the Winter Soldier, and Civil War. Now, Captain America, the First Avenger, I really like. It's actually one of my favorite Phase 1 movies. But, as mentioned, Winter Soldier and Civil War can show how much of a good badass that Captain America is. Not just with the fighting, but how his morality is. In Winter Soldier's case, the company he's working for, S.H.I.E.L.D., turns out to be Hydra, and it's pretty much a big whole who do you trust kind of way. And Captain America still shows his good morals even through all of the darkness underneath. And that's always one of the things I love about Captain America. He is a true optimist. And that's why, like, other than the Hulk and Spider-Man, he is one of my favorite Avengers and one of my favorite superheroes. And with Civil War, a lot of people complain that movie is very one-sided, but it does actually show both sides on who is... And it's kind of hard to say, like, who is right and who is wrong, because both have really good points about why their side is right. And also, like, both of them, because both of these are directed by the Russos, who would later go on to do Infinity War and Endgame. And this shows how great of a choice they were to do those, because the action is so well choreographed and so well done. It's actually quite surprising that all this was actually done practically and not with any use of CGI. Chris Evans, Scarlett Johansson, all the actors in all these movies, like, I've always praised the Avengers actors, or even all the other actors in the MCU, because they are all great in this movie. In both of these, actually. Civil War, I liked Age of Ultron, but this did kind of feel more like a proper Avengers sequel in that sort of sense. But if I had to choose between the two of them, I would definitely have to say maybe Civil War, but I do really love both of them, and they're in my top 10 of the MCU. Speaking of top 10 in the MCU, I will say this, because this one, I will admit, like, both of these are really good. Guardians of the Galaxy and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. It's surprising that even Marvel, the studio, can take really obscure characters, like, because no one's heard of the Guardians of the Galaxy up until this movie. And they did a really good job introducing these bunch of obscure a-holes. Chris Pratt is absolutely fantastic in both these movies. As he's pretty much like the son of Han Solo, pretty much, because he has that sort of Harrison Ford demeanor to him. Of course, like, Rocket Raccoon and Groot are probably my favorite characters in these entire movies. Drax is hilarious. Yondu is really funny too. But I think, while I love the first movie, I think probably my only problem is the villain, Ronan, he's really not that memorable. And while it is a basic sort of team, kind of like a similar Avengers formula, where these teams don't really get along at first, but they have to grow as a family, I will say I do kind of prefer Volume 2 a little more, because I felt that one has a little more heart. Especially with the whole storyline of Peter and his father, Ego, which Kurt Russell is Ego. He is one of the best. Like, Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe has the best villains of any of their movies, and Ego is definitely one of them. Like, he can show off being the calm father, but actually be really terrifying once he gets mad. And, like mentioned, it's really the whole message of fatherhood that really hit close to home for me. While I do love the "I'm Mary Poppins, y'all" meme, the one quote that did hit hard also was, "He may have been your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy." Like, that really hits you in the feels, especially with what happens to Yondu at the end. I'm looking forward to Guardians Volume 3, because I love these characters. Also, speaking of which, the soundtracks. I own both the soundtracks on CD and it's on my iTunes on my phone, because they take a good selection of old 70s, 60s, 80s music and bring them in good moments too, and they're all really great songs. And I'm also really looking forward to seeing, like, what songs, and even how Guardians Volume 3 will turn out, like introducing Adam Warlock maybe. Who knows, but regardless, I look forward to seeing more of our favorite Guardians soon. Alright, next up is another movie that kind of got lost in the shuffle, Edge of Tomorrow. This is a movie that's pretty much Groundhog Day meets Aliens, in a way that you have a group of Marines fighting these alien monsters, and yet one of them, played by Tom Cruise, is stuck in this time loop. Because considering that in the 2010s we had a lot of time loop movies, like the Happy Death Day movies, for example, but I think this one is easily the best out of all of them. Tom Cruise, Emily Blunt, the late Bill Paxton, all the side characters are all really good in the movie. The action is fantastic, and I love that I love that every time Tom Cruise gets killed off and stuck in that time loop, he gets more and more annoyed. It's actually kind of funny. I mean, it's also like just as much as like in Happy Death Day, where she constantly gets killed, but yet does like more out there ridiculous stuff with it. Now, I haven't read the manga it's based on, and because I'm not really that big of an anime fan, even though I like the style. But I probably should give it a read and see how faithful it is to the movie. But Edge of Tomorrow, again, made money, gotten... Again, this is another one, even a lot of this list is mostly movies that people have forgotten about and probably should get more attention as they should. And Edge of Tomorrow is one of the best sci-fi movies to come out of the decade. Alright, moving on to 2015, we have one of the best action movies to come out of the decade, Mad Max Fury Road. Now, at the time when this movie came out, I have never seen any of the Mad Max movies, but once I saw this movie, I went out and watched every Mad Max movie and now I have them on Blu-ray. But I think it's between this and Road Warrior that are my favorite of the series. This is one of the best examples of visual storytelling of any kind of movie, whether it is action or whatever have you, because the movie is told through the visuals, and it's breathtaking. Like, this is one of the most crazy, the most insane visions of the future of any movie, with all these punks running around in these really awesome looking cars. I also picked up the Art of book just to see how they created all this stuff and what went through their minds and how they designed all the cars and such. But other than that, like, even the actors are all really good, and even the characters are likable. I love Furiosa, love Nux. Immortan Joe is one of the best villains to come out of the decade, and he is intimidating, he's scary, but he's also a really insane leader, too. Tom Hardy, though he does get sidelined, he's really good in the movie too. And it's a kind of a surprise that this actually did get nominated for Best Picture, because it, quite frankly, was one of the best movies of 2015. And one of the best action movies. So it's one of my more rewatchable action movies, and I still recommend it any day. Next up is one of Pixar's best movies, and definitely one of their more deeper movies, Inside Out. This is a movie that explores the nature of emotions. More or less, like, the idea of it's okay to be sad. I mean, I know as us guys, we always have to look a certain way. Like, you would be criticized if you were, like, crying or something. But this movie shows that it's okay to be sad. And that's one of the best things about that I really love, is that we can't be happy all the time. As much as I am trying to be a more optimistic person, sometimes you have to let it out sometimes. Even, you can't always be mad, you can't always be happy. You gotta be sad every once in a while, and that's one of the... And again, with Pixar, they did it fantastically. The characters are all likable. I love Joy and Sadness's chemistry and their arc throughout the movie. Bing Bong was such a fun character, and what happens to him near the end is really sad. Riley's a very interesting character as you go see stuff through her eyes. I mean, literally because of the emotions, seeing things through her eyes. And the animation is just as good as, like, a lot of other Pixar movies, because, you know, it's Pixar. They make a lot of great animation. But Inside Out, I understand that this movie actually did help out a lot of people who needed to have a cry. And it's definitely one of those movies to show that. And I'm also looking forward to a movie that I feel is kind of like a predecessor to Inside Out, which is Soul. And it's done by Pete Docter, who directed Inside Out as well. So I'm looking forward to see where that goes, and Inside Out will be forever remembered as being one of Pixar's best movies. Speaking of animation, though, this is another one that I definitely think gets overlooked, and is one of Blue Sky's best, the Peanuts movie. Some of you don't know, I am a huge fan of Charles Schultz's creation of the Peanuts. And this movie, while the story is very simplistic, it's kind of has to be, because this is pretty much Peanuts at its core. Because the movie is unlike a lot of adaptations that try to adapt like a certain nostalgic property but end up doing like something more modern instead of making it a little more timeless, the Peanuts movie feels timeless. It is actually more or less like the comic strip, like the specials, like even down to replicating the animation, the stiff sort of animation of the specials, and it looks great. Even the voice cast of mostly unknown kids, with the exception of Noah Schnapp, who plays Charlie Brown, and he'll later be Will Byers in Stranger Things. He was really good, and even using the archival recordings of Bill Melendez as Snoopy in Woodstock was also really good to see. A lot of people are kind of mixed about the whole Snoopy and the Red Baron subplot throughout the movie, which I didn't mind. Snoopy's one of my favorite characters, and I love the whole adventures with the Red Baron and such. Blue Sky, I think, did a masterful job with living up to Charles Schultz's legacy, and it's without a doubt my favorite of their movies. And I haven't seen a lot more of Blue Sky, but I hope they do more greatness in the future. Alright, next up is a music biography, and that being Straight Outta Compton. Based on the life of NWA, more or less the three members, Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, and Ice Cube. And even when around the time this movie came out and where I was working, some of my boss even told me that, because she lived through some of this, is extremely accurate to what happened. Like, with all the riots and everything else out there. And the movie does a great job showing the whole rise and even eventual split up of NWA. From Eazy-E dying of AIDS, Ice Cube starting his own solo career with movies and writing his own music, Dr. Dre starting his own record label, among many others, and it's helped with the actors performing the roles, especially Ice Cube's own son playing him, he is scarily looking like his father back then, and he's great in the movie too. The music is actually really good too, like, especially if you love NWA songs, because how powerful they are, like, knowing the history of where all these songs came from and how powerful it all was. But other than that, the movie also has this whole thing about basically your destiny in some way. These guys came from a really bad neighborhood, police were hassling them, all that crap. But then once Mike got involved, they went into different paths. Ice Cube, he made the diss track No Vaseline, and then he went on to have a successful movie career and producing career. Dr. Dre went on to do like his own producing career as well, and even doing Dr. Dre beats and helping out people like Snoop Dogg, Eminem, Tupac, as well as, and unfortunately, Eazy-E with his lifestyle, unfortunately passed away with AIDS. But this is one of the best music biographies I have seen. Like, it's right up there with something like Rocket Man. If you have not seen it, I highly recommend it, even if you're not a fan of rap. Break out the torches and pitchforks, fanboys, and come at me, because I'm about to talk about two of the most controversial movies of the decade, or at least from what I've heard, Star Wars The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. Oh boy, remember when it was fun to talk about Star Wars? Remember how it was always fun to discuss things like this? Because at first with The Force Awakens, I know a lot of people complained it's pretty much a retelling of A New Hope, and it's not as if sequels have repeated things from their previous movies beforehand, but I digress. But it was so fun to talk about Star Wars again, praising that it's coming back. But then once The Last Jedi came around, was when everything went to hell. With all the divisive stuff on the internet, all the fanboys, those very elitist fanboys at least. And here's the thing, I actually do like this new trilogy. I love the new characters. I love Rey, Poe, Finn, BB-8, all of them. I love seeing the original characters back again. I love seeing Luke, Leia, Han Solo, Chewie, all of them come back. I love the new worlds they created. I love the action set pieces are really good. And especially with something like The Last Jedi, while I do really love The Force Awakens, it did kind of play things a little safe. With The Last Jedi, they went really ambitious. Now, does everything work in The Last Jedi? Not really. There's some stuff that I can definitely agree with some people, like the casino scene kind of dragged a little bit, and there's some things and some of the humor doesn't completely land. But I do love its whole message of let the past die. And also, like, the whole stuff and twists and turns they go, like Rey's parents were nobodies and stuff like that. Which, while I didn't hate The Rise of Skywalker as much as a lot of people did, it did kind of tick me a bit that it did kind of retcon a lot of things from The Last Jedi just to please the elitist fanboys. And while I still like the movie, and I will probably get it on Blu-ray when it comes out, that's why it's not on my best of for this, but I still like it. I know, and I don't know, just Star Wars, I'm kind of happy that I'm not super hardcore into Star Wars, because I'm honestly more of as you can tell right here, I'm more of an Indiana Jones fan. But, it's just that at first it was fun to talk about Star Wars, but after Last Jedi and everything that's come towards the end of the decade, hasn't quite been as fun due to the elitist fanboys and the gatekeepers. I don't know, maybe at some point, because it's the same kind of crap that happened ever since the prequels, ever since Phantom Menace. Let's just hope that sometime, hopefully in the next few years, that maybe this new sequel trilogy will get a little more respect. Who knows? Time will tell, I suppose. Alright, now we're on to 2016, and not only is this movie one of the most underrated ones of that year, it's one of the most underrated movies of the decade, A Monster Calls. From the director of Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Who am I kidding? I liked Fallen Kingdom also. It's based on a book by Patrick Ness, and me and my sister read this when we were in community college taking an English class, and when we saw there was a movie coming out, we were actually pretty excited, and we went and saw it. And unfortunately, it was kind of a limited release, but we saw it. This is a really this is a movie that's gonna definitely get you in the feels. Much like with Inside Out, it deals with some really dark themes. Much also with about the dangers of balling up your emotions, and it's okay to let them out. But it's also more or less about a much more personal issue about letting go, or at least losing someone that's super close to you, and it's told fantastically. Patrick Ness, the author, wrote the book. Who wrote the book? He also wrote the movie, and it is one of the most faithful adaptations of any book. While it does leave some things out, like the main character Connor has a childhood friend that he's like straying away a lot more, they cut her out to more or less expand on with the relationship between him and his mom, who is dying. Because in the book, the mom was more or less a plot point, but in the movie, she's more of a character. And I'm not going to give away the ending, but once it hits really hard. And not only that, the epilogue they have at the end, which kind of leads to some sort of connection to all of it, is enough to make someone cry. But other than that, the acting all around is great. Felicity Jones, Sigourney Weaver, Toby Kebbell, Liam Neeson voicing the monster with, from what I heard, the motion capture of it, one of them was done by Tom Holland, Spider-Man himself. But the standout is without doubt Louis McDougall as Connor O'Malley, and he is fantastic in this, and surprised he wasn't nominated for anything because he was so good. The visual effects were outstanding. Like, you believe this monster, like this giant Groot, if you will, is real. And not only that, because the whole movie focuses on telling stories, the animation done with those stories is phenomenal. Having this sort of watercolor appearance, but even though it's surprising that it's all done on computer, is fantastic. Like, if you watch this, prepare to get the tissues, because this is one that is really gonna hit you hard. And I recommend it to anyone, especially if you've lost someone who is close to you and you need a sort of a way to kind of help you out, like to help you cope, because this is one of those movies that will definitely help you out. Next up, another movie from Laika, no less, and this is also with Paranorman, one of their best movies, Kubo and the Two Strings. I'm kind of disappointed that this movie didn't do so well, because this is one of Laika's best movies, right up there with Coraline and Paranorman. It may not be for everyone, but it's more or less a really original tale that is done through the whole Eastern culture. The voice acting is all around great, from Art Parkinson as Kubo, Charlize Theron, Matthew McConaughey, surprisingly, Ray Fiennes playing a great villain. I mean, when does he not play a great villain? Rooney Mara as Kubo's creepy-ass aunts she was fantastic. Like, she scared the crap out of me as those two. Both in design and in her voice work, because they are... Oof. Speaking of which, the animation is absolutely one of some of Laika's best. Like, from the battle sequences, the smooth animation. I didn't mention this when I talked about Paranorman. While some of the character designs were a bit ugly, this is a lot more smooth in comparison. Like, it's a little more appealing to look at. And also, that giant stop-motion skeleton that they fought in the movie was a really impressive puppet. And it's even broke a world record for being the biggest stop-motion puppet of all time. But if you have not seen Kubo, I recommend it if anyone's a fan of more or less like the Eastern culture. If anyone's a fan of anime, samurai movies, even as some would say, Studio Ghibli. If you're a fan of those, I highly recommend Kubo. It's one of like his best and one of the best anime movies of the decade. Though speaking of the best anime movies of the decade, Zootopia. One of Disney's most surprising of hits. Because you would think from the trailers it would be this like very cute anime movie with talking animals doing like pretty much a cop movie. And while it is, underneath it is a much more deep message of tolerance. More or less about prejudice and tolerance in that retrospect. I remember when this came out that some were a bit bashing on this movie because some people thought it was a bit preachy. And while I wouldn't call it preachy, as I will admit that while I do love this movie, the whole message does kind of overshadow a bit of the great stuff about this movie, from the animation, the characters, all that. It's still a good movie, and it's still a really relevant message even today, that while we can't fix every problem with prejudice, we can learn to at least be more tolerant and like each other a little more, especially with today. The cast is all around great. I love the chemistry between Judy and Nick. I know a lot of people ship them, but I see them more as great friends, more or less. Animation, I mean, of course it's Disney. Their animation is always going to be great. The score by Michael Giacchino is also fantastic. All around, this is one of Disney's best movies, and admittedly, while I do kind of prefer movies like Wreck-It Ralph, this is still worth mentioning. It's still one of their best movies of the decade. Next up is another movie from Mr. Taika Waititi, that being Hunt for the Wilderpeople. Many people have considered this Taika's best movie, and for that regard, it certainly is. It still retains a lot of what Waititi is known for, from the quirky, offbeat humor, and a surprising amount of heart. But I think the biggest thing that makes this movie is the acting performances and the chemistry between Sam Neill and... I'm blanking on his name. The kid's first name is Julian. I know that. Name will be down below, but you might recognize him as Russell or Fire Fist from Deadpool 2. And both of these guys are great in the movie. From their chemistry, that at first they don't get along, but eventually they have to learn to get along, or at least learn to survive out there in the New Zealand wilderness. It also gets very intense towards the end, because this whole movie is about a manhunt of these two when they're stuck out in the New Zealand wilderness, and there is a sense of urgency throughout. If you haven't seen much of Waititi's movies outside of the other two I'm going to mention later on, I highly recommend this one, because this is one of his best. Along with What We Do in the Shadows, and Boy, which I didn't put on my honorable mentions, but those are worth recommending too. And to round off 2016, we have Sully. Directed by Clint Eastwood, who also did American Sniper, another based on true story thing, and the movie is based on the pilot Sully, who in 2009 landed in the Hudson River as the plane was about to crash in order to save the people. And while all the rest of the stuff that you would expect from Clint Eastwood is good, from the acting of Tom Hanks and especially Aaron Eckhart, who is great in the movie, one of the things I really love about this movie, it's a very personal story. At first, because when the news broke out about this, Sully is praised as a hero. But then once you take into account insurance and stuff like that, you question, was he a hero? And that's what the movie delves into. It delves into, was he a hero? Maybe there was something in there, or maybe he was high or something like that. Like, it's sort of those big questions of what happened during that day. And I've heard some people complain about the flashback sequences because the movie starts right after the event happened, and then it occasionally flashes back to the incident, as well as the whole, like how he got into aviation and stuff, which, personally, I didn't mind. I don't know if the movie would have been better if it was told in chronological order, but I think the whole keeping it the mystery and even showing what happened in between those is actually a little more interesting. And especially towards the third act when they have the hearing, and showing what happened is really intense. It really gets you on the edge of your seat. If you have any admiration for something like that, or even to look up to people, this is a movie I would highly recommend to anyone. Hey guys, it's me. Post point or post video, because while editing this video, I forgot one movie from 2016 that I forgot to put on my list. I can't believe I completely forgot about Arrival. Arrival was done by the same guy who did Prisoners, and it's one of the most original sci-fi movies to have come out of the decade. Amy Adams has a great performance. So does Jeremy Renner. The whole thing building up to the message or the themes of the movie is really good. The aliens themselves, like the cinematography, is fantastic, especially when you see the scope of the alien ship. With that said, make it quick. Arrival was one I should have put on my list, and it should have been on there, but I forgot it. So back to the video. Alright, moving on to 2017, I'm going to start off with an actual R-rated comic book movie that I do have on my best of the year, Logan. Why I do kind of prefer this over Joker is that Logan to me kind of feels a little more personal. Or more or less because I think it's because I've gotten to know these characters ever since the first X-Men movie. And to pretty much see, there's much like with Endgame, pretty much to see their story come to an end. But I think it hits it hard that these characters have grown older. More or less, like Logan, his adamantium skeleton can't protect him any longer. He's starting to lose his healing power. And now that the fact that he has a daughter, he's slowly learning to become more like a father. Also, with Django Unchained, kind of like similar to Django Unchained, it is a modern day Western. With the exception, like, it doesn't take place in the past, in the Old West. It more or less is a future Western. But with characters with superpowers, and honestly, they nailed it. Like, from the very dirty, gritty look of it, the acting, especially from the villain who acts like a Western villain. Speaking of which, all the acting is really good. Hugh Jackman gives probably his best performance as Wolverine. Patrick Stewart as well as Professor Xavier. Daphne Keane, in particular, as X-23, is super good in this, and she is like up there with Hit Girl from the Kick-Ass movies and Eleven from Stranger Things. She is the most badass little girl in any movie. Like, you do not want to mess with her at all. And also, like, especially towards the end, she gives a beautiful, like, really heartfelt performance. It's what you expect from Logan. With the previous ones, I mean, X-Men vs. Wolverine was terrible. I liked the Wolverine. But this, I feel, is kind of like, this is probably the Wolverine movie many people were wanting, because this is where we get to see Logan go full, like, brutal. You see all the blood, the brutality, all that stuff. You see it all from him, from X-23. You see it all, and it's actually a really good choice to make this rated R. If I recommend it, this is easily one of the best comic book movies to come out of the decade. Along with the other Marvel, while I do love the MCU, it's nice that we have something a little bit different like this. Though moving on to an MCU movie, this one is actually become not only one of my favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, but one of my most rewatchable ones, Thor Ragnarok. The Thor movies have a similar pattern, kind of with Wolverine, except they're a little bit better. Like, I like the first Thor movie a lot. I really do. And The Dark World, it has its moments, but it's easily my least favorite MCU movie. I think a lot of people would agree. But with Ragnarok, it gives it a fresh new, like literally a fresh new coat of paint. And especially given, and this is also the movie that introduced me, and when I discovered Taika Waititi as a director. The best way to describe this movie is that you take an old 80s movie, like, or pretty much say it's a modern day remake of something like Flash Gordon or Buckaroo Banzai. You take that sort of like cheesy sci-fi 80s movie, but give it a modern day facelift, and it actually does pay off. And the thing is that it takes itself so seriously, or no, more or less, like, the whole movie is a comedy. It's a real comedy, but it does take itself so seriously while sort of poking fun of the MCU in that sort of sense, if you get what I mean. Apart from the comedy, Chris Hemsworth as Thor is probably among, like, this is when a lot of people start to love Chris Hemsworth as Thor. And even his journey from here to Endgame is really, really touching. But he also not only shows off his great because the previous movie showed off his great physical and action prowess, but also shows off how great he is at comedy. Because, believe it or not, he is really funny, and he is actually a really funny guy. Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk. I mentioned he's one of my favorite superheroes, and along with Endgame, this is probably the Hulk at his best. Because at the time, he actually starts to talk, and he actually starts to become a little more, like, you start to feel more for the Hulk in this one than in any other movie. Tom Hiddleston, of course, all the ladies love him, and he's really good in this movie too. I know a lot of people didn't like Kate Blanchett as Hela, but I actually thought she was really good. Like, you actually kind of feel sorry for her and understand where she's coming from, at least about what happened with her between her and Odin. Not only that, I do think visually it's one of the best visual looking Marvel movies, because the entire movie, especially when we get to the planet Sakaar, and also this is sort of a looser retelling of the Planet Hulk. Like, it's the closest we'll get to a live action Planet Hulk movie. And I think I couldn't ask for anything better than that, because this is the best we're going to get, and I'm happy for that. But the entire look of Sakaar is based on the artwork of Jack Kirby, and like, as you can see from my shirt, I am a Kirby fan, and he's one of my artistic influences. And they beautifully capture the look of Kirby, from the buildings to the costumes to everything else. Like, it is pretty much a 1960s Jack Kirby comic brought to life in that sort of sense. But it's also coupled with the action being super fun and energetic. You root for these characters all throughout. Tessa Thompson, forgot to mention her. Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie is so great in this. But she actually does have a more tragic backstory. But I know a lot of people. There is a complaint I do kind of agree with, is that the humor does kind of overshadow some of the more heartfelt moments, which are really good. But, I don't know, I've gotten used to it, at least then. It doesn't really bother me, and I still really love Ragnarok, and hopefully Taika Waititi will bring the same insanity that comes in Love and Thunder. Let's just hope for that. Next up is one of the most surprising horror movies to come out of the decade, Get Out. Who would have thought that Jordan Peele, who many people know him for sketch comedy with his friend Keegan-Michael Key, and he would make a horror movie? Because when that trailer dropped, everyone thought it was a joke. Like, Jordan Peele making a horror movie? Like, this isn't going to turn out well. But then when people saw it, it's like, holy crap. Like, he actually made a really good, suspenseful horror movie. And while I really liked Us, I do think Get Out is slightly better. Because Get Out, I think, has a much more... I don't know, it's hard to say, like, because I do think both movies are really good, but I do kind of prefer... I think Get Out has a little bit more to it. Like, I think it's really suspenseful. You feel for Chris, the main guy. Daniel Kaluuya is really good in it. The parents are creepy as hell. His friend, the TSA agent, Lil Rel Howery is super funny in this. And the thing is, I do think it kind of balances, like, the really dark, suspenseful horror aspect, but also balances out with the comedy that we're used to seeing from Jordan Peele. But I do think why I do kind of edge it over Us is that you do feel a more sense... I mean, much like with Us, you do feel a more sense of dread, and also more or less, you feel like you're in a dream in certain things. Like, when she sends him to the sunken place, it's like something you have never seen in any horror movie, especially with this dark void that happens when you're hypnotized. It's really visually outstanding. Like I mentioned in my best of the year when I talked about Us, here's to hoping that Jordan Peele makes some great horror movies after this and Us, because he has the talent for becoming a really great horror director. And lastly, for 2017, we have another Edgar Wright movie, Baby Driver. This is the movie I've said that this kind of proves that Edgar Wright can almost do no wrong, and I'm looking forward to Last Night in Soho. But this is his take on pretty much a robbery movie, like a caper film, in a way. But I think the best aspect about it is the whole theme of music. More or less, the entire movie is edited to the music. Like, for instance, there's a shootout happening, and when they're shooting the guns, the sounds mimic the music playing in the background. Like, there's a whole entire chase scene set to Hocus Pocus by Focus, and during that all of it is, like, synced perfectly with the music, and it is, like, really amazing how they did that. Not only that, the acting is really good. Ansel Elgort, as much of a creeper as Kevin Spacey is, he's still really good. Jamie Foxx is great as always. The action, like, it shows also that Edgar Wright's actually a really good action director. With Scott Pilgrim, The World's End, and this, he's shown he actually can make some really good action, especially with the car chases, which are really outstanding. It's also his most, like, up there with the Cornetto movies, this is one of his most original movies. And I know a lot of people complain that we see too much of, like, remakes, sequels, and all that. But people tend to forget some of the more original movies, like Baby Driver. And they really shouldn't, because this is one of the best movies of the decade. And one of the best examples of really good editing. Me again. So, this time there's two movies from 2017 I forgot to put on there, and I'll make them quick. The first one is The Disaster Artist, what I consider this generation's Ed Wood. For what it is, like, the movie's really well done. James Franco actually proves to be a really good director, as well as his great performance as Tommy Wiseau. His brother Dave does a good job as Greg Sestero. It's a really good look into the mind of Tommy Wiseau in that way. And also, I really love the ending where it shows, like, the making of The Room. Like, even, no, not just the making, but also recreating scenes from The Room. And they did a good job with that. And the other one is Pixar's Coco, which I can't believe I forgot this one, because this is one of Pixar's best movies. Even as a 25-year-old white guy from Texas, this does a really good job with the whole Mexican Day of the Dead. And even if you're not, like, from that culture, you can still relate to the themes of family. Even if the movie is full of cliches, it is still a really well-made movie. The characters are likable, the animation's gorgeous, the music, the songs are really good, and the ending will make you cry, so prepare for that. Ironic for a movie with a song called Remember Me, I can't believe I forgot about this movie. Anyway, back to the video. Alright, we are down to 2018, and let's talk about a documentary. More or less, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Again, I still haven't seen A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, so I don't know how that is in comparison to this. But I think this is a movie I think a lot of people really need right now. More or less, while no one can replace him, we do kind of need a Mr. Rogers. The world, as of late, especially with certain things of the media and of news and stuff and politics, we've all grown so bitter, we've grown so cynical that we've forgotten how to love each other that way. We've forgotten to tolerate each other. And this documentary shows that how much of an impact Mr. Rogers' lessons have taught to us. And I have watched Mr. Rogers when I was a kid. Granted, more of the stuff I did watch as a kid was stuff like Sesame Street and Arthur, but I did watch a bit of Mr. Rogers. And his lessons are really that impactful to show that we can be better people if we just give it a try. And the thing is, even with compared to other sort of documentaries, they also show that Mr. Rogers wasn't perfect. He was still human. And that's always a good thing to show that even the most humble people are not that perfect. If you're ever feeling like you have a tough day, or if you feel like you're not, like if you're just not being yourself, I highly recommend watching this, because I think this could kind of lift your spirits up. In times like this, we do need a little bit of hope. Alright, next up we have one of the most surprising animated movies, and it's quickly become one of my favorite movies, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. No one would have believed how much of a big deal this movie would have been, and because considering this is done by Sony Animation, and don't get me wrong, Sony's movies, their anime movies, while I haven't seen a lot of them, there's some I really like. I really like the Hotel Transylvania movies, and I really like Surf's Up. I haven't seen Open Season in a long time to see how that turned out, if it's still held up, but I do think they have a good prowess. But after something like the Emoji Movie, which is bad, but I don't think it's like the worst animated movie of all time, like so many people say, they needed a bigger hit. And with Spider-Verse, this proved to be more or less their magnum opus. It's pretty much, this is the best way I could describe this movie, is that it's pretty much Spider-Man's Lego Batman movie, in that it pokes fun at Spider-Man. Like, this really does make fun of a lot of stuff we've seen in previous Spider-Man movies, comics, etc., but it also celebrates it by telling it's a new original story. I haven't really read much of the Miles Morales story, or the comics, but after this movie I kind of really want to, because he is so likable, he is so relatable. I love the chemistry he has, like, or even the relationships he has throughout the movie. Like, I was really interested from the relationship with his parents, especially his dad, the relationship with his Uncle Aaron, the budding friendship between him and Gwen Stacy is so cute. His friendship with Peter B. Parker, in which the whole concept of Peter B. Parker to me is just hilarious. And I also really like the new Spider-Man characters, like Penny Parker, Spider-Ham. My personal favorite being Spider-Man Noir. Nicolas Cage played him, he was so good. I know the animation, at first when you see it from the trailers, it looks very stilted, but it does actually, you do get used to it throughout the whole movie, because much like with something like, this is a much more animated Scott Pilgrim, in that you feel like you're actually in a living comic book, or at least watching a living comic book right in front of you. And it does. And I also love the mixing of the animation together. Like you get your usual CG, but they also mix it in with stuff like 2D, or even mix it in with other art styles. Like Spider-Man Noir is entirely black and white, or Spider-Ham is literally done like a Looney Tunes, like a 2D Looney Tunes cartoon. And Penny Parker is pretty much a fully like an anime character in that way. It's definitely Sony's most experimental film, and hopefully with that Spider-Verse sequel, I am hoping it does live up to the greatness that was Spider-Verse. I saw this movie twice when it came out in theaters, seen it a lot of times on Blu-ray, and it has become my favorite Spider-Man movie, and I hope to see more. Alright, I doubt anyone's going to put this on their best of list in, but since this is my video on my channel, I'm putting it on there anyway. Ready Player One. Definitely one of the most fun movies I've experienced in a theater. Like, this movie is such a blast. It has its problems, to be sure. Like, some of the dialogue's a bit cringy. Sorrento is he's kind of a basic villain. But I think what makes up for it is the whole story is pretty much an idea of, it's Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory mixed with the Matrix. And you put it all together, and it actually does make for a very interesting idea. I love the concept of the Oasis, where you could be anything, be anyone. It's like the perfect escapism, and I almost want it to be real. But it does have a very, good message about the themes of escapism, or at least spending too much time out, in your house or watching YouTube videos, for example, and pretty much showing, the importance of reality in that way. And it's really beautifully done. Speaking of which, the CGI especially, this is one of Spielberg's best looking movies. It is gorgeous to look at, from the wonderful designs of the avatars. It is pretty much the biggest pop culture movie, and I know a lot of people complain that it is too much of that, or too much fan service, but I do think it's it can be too much, but I do think it's done a little bit more organically. And a lot of times, Spielberg, because there was a lot of stuff like that in the book, and I do think this movie is a little bit better than the book. I have read the book. But the entire movie, Spielberg doesn't, pretty much stroke his ego, because there's not too much of his references how much it was in the book, but it does actually beautifully done in some other scenes. The whole Shining sequence was excellent, how they successfully recreated the house from The Shining. And it's also just fun. I really love the climax, but when the battle at Planet Doom happens at the end, I got chills, because it was such an adrenaline rush. It was so much fun. And while Endgame tops it, it still gives me a lot of fun to watch even to this day. Like I said, it may not be on a lot of people's best of the decade, but I certainly enjoy it enough to put it on my best of the decade. Alright, now we've reached the home stretch of 2019, and some of them I've already talked about, like Toy Story 4, Endgame, How to Train Your Dragon. So I'm going to talk about at least two of the movies I put on there, and I'll make it quick, because if you want to hear fuller thoughts, watch my best of 2019. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Quentin Tarantino, he ends the decade on a much more laid-back note than pretty much his other movies. Compared to his other ones, this is way more relaxed and laid-back than his others. I love hanging out with Rick Dalton, his stuntman, and Sharon Tate, because they are really interesting characters, and you want to see them get back on top on a very, pretty much to show back then how Hollywood was. And it's a really interesting time capsule. Again, people were split on the ending, but Tarantino has fictionalized history before, and I just did really love how insane it got towards the end. And it was less insulting than Haunting of Sharon Tate. At least that's one thing. And of course, Jojo Rabbit. I've said it in the video, I'll say here, Taika Waititi, you're a comedic genius. He takes something that could have been done in poor taste in a movie that pokes fun of the Nazis, but shows how dangerous their closed-mindedness was. And it's done, beautifully. It's even though the whole movie is still pretty much your usual stuff, very quirky, very offbeat, and really funny, close to the third act, it hits you hard. It really does hit. Which I think is the best way to do it. It's it'll ease you into the darker stuff in order to impact its message. And it's really well done. The cast is all great. Scarlett Johansson, Sam Rockwell, Taika Waititi as imaginary Hitler was really good. The standouts were the kids. Particularly Roman Griffin Davis and Thomasin McKenzie as JoJo and Elsa. They had really good chemistry together. And they carried the film. Both of them were really good. And Archie Yates, the kid who plays Yorkie, JoJo's friend, was super funny. Like, he had such good comedic timing. And much like with Cinemac Excrement, I definitely see a future with him in comedy because he was just super funny. It's surprisingly getting a lot of Oscar buzz lately. I'm actually quite surprised that Jojo Rabbit got nominated for Best Picture, which, quite frankly, it is one of the best movies of 2019. It's probably not in theaters anymore, but for anyone who wants to see it, it's coming out on Blu-ray in February, and it's coming out digitally on February. Do yourself a favor, go out and rent it, and if you love it after you rented it, go buy it. It is such a good movie, one of the best comedies, and it teaches us all that despite our differences, we can also learn to tolerate each other and just follow our own opinion and be more tolerant. I think that's the best thing we can take out of it. Be more tolerant to one another. Whew. And that was that. Oh. Okay. Take two. And that was that. Those were my best movies of the decade. Thank you so much for trekking along with me on this. I'm sorry that this came out so late in February, no less, but, work and all that stuff, I had to make time for that, but look forward to more videos coming soon, hopefully. If I have the time and if I have some good material, I am going to deliver on those to you guys, okay? So thank you all for watching, and let me know, what are your best movies of the decade? List them down below in the comments, because I am so curious to hear everyone's thoughts. With that being said, this is Clayton, signing out.